Welcome back to Coming the HFY, the channel where the galaxy learns, sometimes the hard way, that humanity might be young among the stars, but when it comes to loyalty, we don't just talk about it. We prove it. So before we begin, if you enjoy powerful sci-fi stories where humans stand their ground against impossible odds, make sure you subscribe to Coming the HFY. Because the story you're about to hear is one that several alien civilizations still discuss in quiet conference rooms when the topic of human behavior comes up, and it begins far away from Earth in a lonely stretch of space called the Helios Drift, where the exploration vessel Seraphel of the Luminary Concordance moved slowly through the wreckage of a destroyed cargo convoy. Ambassador Talin Voss stood on the observation platform watching fragments of metal and frozen cargo containers drift silently past the hull while his three glowing eyes adjusted to the dim reflections of the nebula outside, and for Talin this scene was simply another entry in the endless catalogue of galactic events because his species had been traveling the stars for nearly 12,000 years, and in that time they had witnessed supernovas, planetary extinctions, and wars that erased entire civilizations. So a shattered convoy was merely another data point in the archives of the Concordance. The Luminari were explorers, observers, historians of the galaxy, and Talin was very good at emotional distance because distance was considered a virtue in Luminari culture. Emotions clouded judgment, compassion complicated diplomacy, and curiosity was the only acceptable motivation for action. So when the ship's sensor officer suddenly interrupted the quiet of the bridge with a slightly confused report, Talin did not react immediately. "Ambassador, we're detecting a biological signal among the debris. It's extremely weak," the officer said, clearly surprised, and Talin slowly turned his tall, silver-skinned frame toward the console. Before asking the obvious question, "Species identification?" The officer hesitated before answering, "Human. One survivor," and that single word caused several of the bridge crew to glance at each other with mild interest because humans were a relatively new addition to the Galactic Concordance Registry, a young species that had barely mastered interstellar travel 2 centuries earlier and was still widely considered unpredictable, emotional, and technologically behind most established civilizations, which meant they rarely appeared in official reports. Except as trade partners or diplomatic observers. Talin considered the information for a moment before giving a calm instruction: retrieve the life form, not out of sympathy but because Concordance regulations required that surviving members of any recognized species be recovered when possible. And several minutes later a damaged escape pod was pulled into the hangar bay with only 8 minutes of breathable oxygen remaining inside. When the hatch finally opened, the rescue team found a human male in a battered engineering suit, barely conscious but still stubbornly alive. His right shoulder badly burned, the chest plate of his suit cracked open from impact, and yet when they carried him aboard the Seraphel he blinked up at the towering alien figures surrounding him and managed to say in a dry voice, "Man, you guys took your sweet time," which caused several of the Luminari crew to exchange puzzled glances because humor in the face of imminent death was a behavior they did not fully understand. The human identified himself as Daniel Carter, Chief Systems Engineer of the Terran cargo vessel Atlas Dawn, a freighter that had apparently been ambushed and destroyed in the Helios Drift several hours earlier. And according to the medical officer, Carter's survival bordered on impossible because the escape pod had suffered structural failure during ejection and the internal impact should have ruptured multiple organs, yet somehow the human body had endured the trauma long enough to keep him alive. Ambassador Talin found this detail scientifically interesting, though he did not comment on it as Carter was placed in the medical bay and stabilized with regenerative treatment. For the next 2 days the situation aboard the Seraphel remained calm, Carter slowly recovering while the Luminari crew continued cataloging debris from the destroyed convoy, until a priority transmission cut through the ship's communications network like a blade. The signal came from the Dravari Imperium, a powerful and notoriously aggressive empire that controlled several heavily militarized star systems and had a reputation for enforcing its claims through intimidation rather than diplomacy. The message they sent to the Seraphel was short, formal, and unmistakably threatening. The Terran vessel destroyed in the Helios Drift had been transporting stolen Dravari navigation archives. The surviving human aboard the Luminari ship was therefore property of the Imperium, and the Concordance vessel was ordered to surrender him within 48 hours or face appropriate corrective action, which was the Dravari way of saying warships would arrive soon. Talin Voss studied the transmission carefully because from a diplomatic standpoint the decision was painfully simple. His ship was an exploration vessel equipped with minimal defensive systems. The Dravari possessed battle fleets capable of reducing planets to ash, and the human in question was technically a stranger, whose life held little strategic value to the Concordance. But something about the situation bothered him enough that he decided to speak with Carter directly before responding. When Talin entered the medical bay, he found the human sitting upright on the recovery bed eating ration packs with surprising enthusiasm despite the bandages across his torso. And when the ambassador explained the Dravari accusation, Carter's expression changed from casual exhaustion to something sharper. "They're lying," Carter said bluntly. "My crew wasn't stealing anything. We were delivering evidence to the Galactic Concordance Intelligence Bureau. The Dravari have been altering navigation charts in contested trade corridors so rival freighters crash into restricted zones. Then they claim salvage rights over the wreckage. Dozens of ships have disappeared because of it." And when he finished speaking he added quietly, "My entire crew died making sure that data got out." Leaving the room silent for several seconds. Talin had spent his life studying civilizations, and he recognized the tone in Carter's voice. The tone of someone who had lost everything and still refused to surrender the reason behind that loss. And in that moment, the ambassador made a decision that several members of his crew would later describe as uncharacteristically emotional, because instead of complying with the Dravari demand he transmitted a single-word reply back to the Imperium command channel, "Denied." The problem Talin did not anticipate was that while he was sending that message, Daniel Carter was quietly accessing the Seraphel's communication terminal and transmitting a compressed emergency signal toward Earth. A simple burst packet containing coordinates, the Dravari ultimatum, and a short line of text. "Ambassador Talin Voss saved my life and refused to hand me over. They may destroy his ship for it." 14 hours later that message reached the United Earth Defense Network, where it was routed directly to Fleet Admiral Helen Ward aboard the command carrier UEF Horizon, and the Admiral's response required exactly 6 seconds of consideration before she issued orders to the nearest rapid response battle group. "All ships, set immediate course for Helios Drift, maximum FTL." Which meant that within minutes 17 Terran warships, destroyers, cruisers, 2 carriers, and the flagship Horizon were accelerating into faster-than-light transit with engines pushed well beyond standard safety limits. Meanwhile in the Helios Drift the Dravari arrived first, 3 heavily armed warcruisers dropping out of hyperspace directly in front of the defenseless Seraphel, their weapon arrays locking onto the Hoomanity vessel as their commander transmitted one final demand: surrender the human or be destroyed. Talin Voss stood on his bridge watching the tactical display, knowing he had no military options left and quietly preparing to accept responsibility for the consequences of his decision. Until every sensor aboard the Seraphel suddenly erupted with alerts as 17 new energy signatures appeared across the system in a perfect crescent formation. Terran warships exiting FTL one after another with frightening precision. The Dravari commander barely had time to react before a calm human voice filled every communication channel in the sector. "This is Fleet Admiral Helen Ward of the United Earth Defense Fleet. The individual aboard that Concordance vessel is under our protection. Any hostile action against that ship will be considered an act of war against humanity. You have 60 seconds to leave this system." And according to the Seraphel's sensor logs, the Dravari cruisers remained perfectly still for 11 seconds before abruptly engaging their jump drives and vanishing into hyperspace without firing a single shot. When the silence returned to the Helios Drift, Daniel Carter stepped onto the Hoomanity bridge beside Ambassador Talin, and both of them stared at the massive Terran fleet floating calmly in open space as if crossing 40 light-years in less than a day was an ordinary inconvenience. Talin finally spoke in a slow, thoughtful tone. "Your species has existed in interstellar society for only 2 centuries, and yet your government has deployed an entire battle group to defend a single engineer." And Carter simply shrugged before answering quietly, "Ambassador, you stood up to an empire for someone you barely knew. Back home we have a rule about that." He paused briefly before finishing the sentence. "We don't leave people behind, and we never forget the ones who refuse to abandon us." And Talin Voss, historian of 1,000 civilizations, realized in that moment that humanity possessed a trait the Concordance had rarely seen displayed so clearly in the history of the galaxy. Not aggression, not bravery, but loyalty so powerful that an entire fleet would cross the stars to repay a single act of courage. After a long silence, the ambassador turned back toward the observation window where the Terran ships held their formation in silent watch over the small survey vessel, and he spoke softly to himself. It appears, humanity has been underestimated. While beside him Daniel Carter smiled faintly and replied, "Yeah, happens a lot." And out in the endless darkness of space the United Earth Fleet remained exactly where it was. Steady, patient, and completely unafraid.